Welcome, students of Form 3. We're going to talk about African labor other than sugar production, and then especially about those questions that are about explaining and describing in depth. And we're going to do two goals for the test and guide you through them, and also looking at the questions to what exactly is asked, and also the difficult words in the question. Let's look at goal 8. Assess means looking at it if it's good, is it bad, what is the advantage, what is its disadvantage. So assess both logwood and mahogany in its requirement of labor in Belize economy and and explain in your own words in some depth what this meant for the use of slave labor. Actually, two questions. Assess logwood and mahogany in its requirement of labor, and explain in your own words in some depth the consequences, what this meant for the use of slave labor. Yeah? So if it would be a question in the test, you would get 4 marks for each part of the question. Let's look at the answer. 3 steps that are in there, or perhaps more. Logwood required, needed the labor of just a few men because it was a small tree and it grew in clumps. And clumps means it grew in small groups together. So it was not just like loose trees, there one and far away one. No, they grew in clumps, small groups together. And it was a small tree. Mahogany required much more men than logwood. Mahogany was a rather thick tree and it required more men and also machinery to make profit out of its production. Yeah. So you see logwood and mahogany in its requirement of labor. Then the end of the question. This meant for the use of slave labor that logwood required a limited amount of enslaved Africans on the one hand, while mahogany needed large numbers of slaves. So when the economy of beliefs changed to mahogany, as a consequence, also the number of Africans expanded, because we know mahogany requires more men, more machinery, more labor when you want to make profit out of it. Yeah? So these 3 parts of the answer is needed. Yeah? And this part is the first half of the question that says logwood and mahogany in its requirement of labor, 4 points. And now the second half, what did this mean for the use of slave labor? Yeah, and we see logwood required a limited amount of enslaved Africans, while mahogany, at the other hand, needed large numbers of slaves. So, as a consequence, when the economy of beliefs changed to mahogany, the number of Africans expanded as a consequence. Then the next goal. Explain in your own words how mahogany production created a different relationship between slave and master in colonial Belize by describing the specific work that was needed for mahogany production. Again, here, 2 halves of the question. How did mahogany create a different relationship? And describe the specific work that was needed for mahogany production, because this explains it. Different from what? Mahogany production, different relationship. What are you talking about? Well, different from the usual sugar plantations or coffee plantations or cotton plantations where you had a slave, a master, you had a foreman leading the work, and there was a regularity or predictability of the work. And also, the slave master could see the work that was done, could inspect it, and it was all in the vicinity of the plantation house and the master. So you could say it was pretty predictable, orderly, and it had a certain rhythm to it. and it was yeah, it was the majority of slave labor in the Caribbean. Well, a big chunk of it anyway was like that. Then, how mahogany production created a different relationship by describing the specific work. Mahogany created a different relationship between slave and master in Belize because the production of mahogany demanded slash needed specific jobs and thus also specific skills. So mahogany asked specific know-how, skills, activities of the enslaved Africans. Among other activities, specialized huntsmen, for instance, had to go into the forest to find mahogany trees. Yeah. And not only this, you also needed slaves that could cut the trees, smaller trees. You needed the slaves that worked around the big chunk. You needed slaves to make timber out of it. You needed slaves to drive cattle. Yeah. And as you see in this picture, you needed all kinds of different sorts of different skilled slaves. Yeah. And this was the consequence of focusing more on mahogany instead of logwood. You needed all kinds of skilled slaves. You see here, you see them over there, you see them in the corner, you see them over there. You needed all kinds of different skills and activities. So we're going to get to the second part of the goal now. Because of this, what we saw in the picture just now, the master and the slave together had to cover long distances in the forest of Belize to find the specific mahogany trees. Compared to the relative clear relationship between master and slave. In, for instance, the sugar plantations, the picture I showed earlier, or the coffee plantations, or the cotton plantations, the dynamics, the relationship, the interaction between slave and master must have been different because they had to go into the forest for miles and miles, for kilometers and kilometers. They didn't know when they would find a mahogany tree, perhaps within a day, but perhaps it took a few days, perhaps longer. So they were like dependent on each other and they had a different freedom. The slave, perhaps he could escape, but also the master needed the slave in this journey to find the mahogany trees. So the dynamics between the slave and master must have been different.